Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer. And today's video is an episode in the series entitled Real Estate Fundamentals You Should Know. And today we're talking about the Pending Sale Contingency Addendum, Form 22Q in the statewide forms system. Listing brokers, never let your seller accept an offer from a buyer with a Form 22Q, a pending sale contingency addendum, if the pending sale, a copy of the pending sale, is not attached or made part of the Form 22Q. How can a seller accept an offer contingent on the occurrence of event without knowing anything about the event that has to occur? I receive too many email hotline questions from brokers saying something along the following lines. And these are listing brokers, of course. The buyer has a pending sale contingency in the agreement. We were told that the pending sale was X. Make up whatever terms you want. They're always glorious, wonderful terms. And now that we're close to closing, it turns out that the terms are really Y, and that buyer's not going to be closing that transaction. And so wouldn't the lack of honesty or the misrepresentation or whatever you want to call it justify seller's retention of the earnest money from this Form 22Q buyer whose sale didn't close and they now want out of the agreement based on the pending sale contingency? And you know, I can't answer that question. That's a question that a court's going to have to answer. Is there a good faith violation by the buyer, and did that justify, a decision that the earnest money should go to the seller? But honestly, I don't care at this point what the answer to that question is, because we never ever get to that question if listing brokers do their jobs. Because the listing broker should never let the seller accept a Form 22Q offer from a buyer if the pending sale is not attached to the Form 22Q. So that we never get to a position close to closing where the seller is learning for the first time the true nature of that pending sale. Now, it might be that the buyer misrepresented the quality of the buyer in the pending sale or something like that. That's a different issue. The questions I'm getting on the hotline right now clearly indicate that the seller never saw the actual pending sale. Listing brokers, don't ever let your seller be in that position. If you get a Form 22Q offer from a buyer and your seller wants to accept it and the pending sale is not attached, do not let your seller advance until you get a copy of that pending sale and you and the seller have an opportunity to consider it. Okay, we've got a 22Q in the transaction, and let's assume that the pending sale was attached. Now we're moving forward. Understand that under the 22Q, and this is different from the home sale contingency, Form 22B, but under the pending sale contingency, Form 22Q, there is no bump provision for the seller. So if seller gets a competing offer, seller has no ability to accept that competing offer and then bump the 22Q buyer. So there's no bump provision, and the closing date of the transaction is the closing date identified on the face of Form 21. Again, Form 22B has a different outcome. The home sale contingency controls the closing date. But under Form 22Q, the closing date of the transaction is the closing date identified on the face of Form 21. For that reason, buyer, you are prohibited from giving your buyer, your pending sale buyer, an extension to their closing date unless that extension will not impact the Form 21 closing date between you and your seller. Let's give an example of that. Your closing date with seller is, let's say, July 15th, and the closing date between you and your pending sale buyer is June 30th. If buyer needs an extension to July 3rd, then you could make that extension. But if buyer needs an extension to July 30, you cannot give buyer that extension without first renegotiating a new closing date with seller. In other words, you're going to have seller's consent and agreement to change the closing date in the agreement between you and seller. Finally, if buyer waives the pending sale contingency, when would that happen? That would happen if buyer's pending sale fails. And instead of wanting to terminate the agreement with seller, the pending sale buyer instead says, you know what, I just want to close the transaction anyhow. Then when the pending contingency buyer, so the Form 22Q buyer, waives the Form 22Q, buyer also waives all other contingencies benefiting buyer. So if buyer still has a financing contingency or an inspection contingency, waiver of the Form 22Q will waive those and any other contingencies benefiting the buyer. That's a nutshell discussion of Form 22Q. If you have questions on Form 22Q or any of our forms, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.